Savages.
What?
Let all the savages in.
They're not all. There's only 2 savages that watch this.
That's true. No one was waiting though.
There was 2 waiting.
Sorry.
2 waiting, but there's always just like a little delay. Till it starts showing.
Giving us an ad on our own thing, huh?
Yeah. Okay, go for it.
Let's do it. So, welcome to number 58 of From the Ground Up. I'm saying that with confidence, even though I don't know, just like any other time. So, if you guys have listened to us before, you know that we have shirts for sale, like the one that I'm wearing right now, Snakes and Beer shirt. Just dropped my phone. Theportcitypythons shirt. We have the new Rugrats Reptile shirt up there, and any money that you put into a shirt usually goes to either support the podcast or support the YouTube videos or do anything that we do here. And then also you can click on our Amazon links, which all you do is click on the links below in the description of this podcast or on any of our YouTube videos. It will say like some of my favorite herb supplies. And then if you buy anything on Amazon, doesn't have to be those items. You can click on those items and then go buy something else. And then we get a small kickback from that from you just doing your shopping normally.
Yes.
What else do we have?
Heads up. Carpet Fest. We say this every week. Southern Carpet Fest, May 4th and 5th in Elmo, Texas at Ryan Sullivan's House of Ivory Connection.
Hit up Evan Browder of Carpet Cartel or us, I suppose.
If you want more
Ivory
details.
Mon King or whoever you really want to.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll get more details as it comes closer. I feel like it's getting closer and closer.
Still a month.
Yeah.
More than a month. Though? Yes.
We're going to have to get the auction going and stuff like that and try to beat Ian Bissell with his like $1 million raise for USR on the damn thing.
I don't think you can beat Ian.
Mm-mm. Ian is very detailed.
Yes,
and
he made it happen really for Southeast.
So that means that we need to not be lazy idiots, but...
Okay, that was harsh. Okay, let's introduce our guest.
Sorry for calling myself an idiot.
Yes, let's introduce our guest.
All right, today we have... Today we have Ray Morgan of the Venom Interviews. So Ray actually lives in Costa Rica. So Ray, can you tell us a little bit of what you do and then what you're doing in the States right now?
Okay. Hey guys, thank you for having me on. First of all, I appreciate it. So I most of my time is spent these days editing video. Most of my work centers around science communication stuff in one way or another. So the one that most people are aware of is the Venom Interviews documentary film that was released almost exactly 2 years ago in March of 2016. So it's been out for a couple of years. My current project is dealing with snake bite and treatment in sub-Saharan Africa. And I guess we can dig into that in some detail later on. As far as Costa Rica goes, I moved down there about 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, and I live up in the north part of the country near Lake Arenal. And my work there in connection with snakes is mostly educational. I do some training programs for things like fire departments and tour guides and whenever possible, the general public. I like to talk to people and get them not to kill things and help them appreciate things. And when they find snakes that they don't want, which are very common, it's the tropics, call me instead of killing them. So that's a very satisfying part. So my indoors is chopping up video. My outdoors is moving snakes around.
So obviously you're from the States. So what triggered you to move to Costa Rica?
Yeah, I'm originally from California. Lived in Southern California almost all my life. My wife and I were down in Mexico in I think 2000 or 2001. And long story short, we ended up in Costa Rica accidentally on a side excursion from Mexico, and we just completely fell in love with the place. And it took a few years to get ourselves where we could make a living working remotely. We both work with clients. Our clients are in the U.S. or in Europe, or in my wife's case, they're all over the world. And so we're able to do that as long as we have an internet connection. And so once we got to that point, we said, let's pull the trigger. Let's go down to Costa Rica. We explored the whole country, coast to coast and top to bottom. And the area that we really love is around the lake. It's the only big lake in the country, and it's mid-altitude. It's cool. Our area has a very long rainy season. It's very wet. Rains for about 9 months of the year. The rain is backing off right about now, but it starts again at the end of May. So, as far as the animals around the area go, we have, the stuff that usually I get called to remove are things like Bothrep's asper, the big lancehead vipers. We have lots of eyelash vipers, lots of hognose vipers. We have 4 different coral snakes, depending on how you count them. So we have a lot of animals around there.
So were you always interested in reptiles, or is this something that came once you moved?
Oh no, I started catching lizards when I was 5 years old, and by the time I think I was 7, I was into snakes, and by the time I was 8 or 9, I had taken over the entire garage. I had booted the cars out, and the entire walls of the garage, floor to ceiling, were lined with snake cages, and the interior part was dedicated to raising rodents to feed them all. So I think by the time I was 12, there was probably 200 snakes in the garage.
Oh,
what
kind of animals were you?
I was going to say, you have some very forgiving parents.
Oh yeah, it was, in retrospect, I can't even believe I got away with what I got away with. But yeah, they were pretty tolerant and pretty indulgent. And I lived in Chino Hills at the time, and Chino Hills at the time was a very rural area. It was kind of the leading edge of development going into the wilderness in that part of Southern California, which is it's not quite desert, but it's kind of drier grassland, until it's completely built up. So we had lots of king snakes and gopher snakes and ringneck snakes. We had red diamond rattlesnakes, some coach whips, all the usual snakes that people find in Southern California. And then within a couple of years, when people start realizing, oh, this guy's into snakes, then I'd have things like, I get a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning saying, hey, there's a big gopher snake in your mailbox and it's really angry and you better take it out before the mailman gets there. So that, that kind of pattern, once you're into stuff, people call you when they find stuff. And strangely enough, that's still what happens down in Costa Rica. I have, a huge amount of the herping I do is herping that other people do for me. They find stuff and call me, and all I have to go do is pick it up.
So where did your interest in venomous reptiles start?
As I went through the Venom Interviews project, I asked myself that question a lot. Because I was asking other people that question, and so I had 100 hours or a couple of 100 hours of driving time to think about that. For the Venom Interviews project, I was interested in telling a story about people who work with reptiles, work with snakes specifically. Some story that hadn't really been told before. And I went through a couple of options. One of the things I considered was the story with the Burmese pythons in South Florida. I looked at that, and it looked like somebody else was kind of covering that story at the time. But one thing that really occurred to me is that people who work with venomous animals, but both the animals and the people who work with them were so badly portrayed, so badly mischaracterized, to the point that they're almost cartoon characters. So I became interested in telling that story. And so the film is largely it's more about the people than the animals. There's plenty of animals and there's plenty about the animals, but it's really meant to tell the story of the people who the real people who do the real work with the animals.
Yeah. To me, that's such a polarizing group as far as venomous, because here in Texas, obviously, we have a lot of venomous keepers, and you kind of have that like 25% where you're like, nah, dude, I don't want to go near you. And like the 75% of people doing the good stuff. How do you promote the people doing the good stuff and kind of, weed out who's doing the bad stuff?
Oh, man. Well, I guess there's a couple of answers to that. So I was in Texas yesterday. Actually, I woke up this morning in Texas. I flew out of Austin very, very early this morning. I was doing a presentation to the Austin Herp Society up, Tim Cole's group up there, and they're a group of excellent, wonderful, responsible, very experienced keepers. But as far as how you separate them, I really try not to spend a lot of time on people who are in it for ego reasons, or people who do unnecessarily risky things with the animals, people who are really primarily concerned with daredevil type stuff or drawing attention to themselves. That it doesn't interest me very much. I'm kind of a nerd in that I gravitate toward the scientific work that's going on, and so I'm interested in people who are doing legit science with the animals, or even private keepers who just take the animals seriously and are serious about learning about them. So I guess it's just kind of my nature that's what I gravitate to. And the other stuff that you mentioned, the 25%, I just try not to spend too much time. I tend not to engage very much with it. I have a hard time being nice when if somebody's doing something that's bad for the community, if it's something you care about, it's hard to be nice when somebody's making things worse. And so that's not healthy. And I try to spend most of my time with people that are making things better. And there's lots of them.
Right. Yeah, we have a particular guy here in Texas who likes to make things worse. And not too long ago.
I could guess. Yeah, enough said. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I don't know who you're talking about, but let's not go down that road.
Yeah. Well, things like that they're not productive, and you can call people out, and you can make it personal, and you can make it a fight, and that doesn't. You put people in a position where they feel like they have to defend themselves, and the people who are doing reckless things, it's been my experience that they're not really receptive to mentoring or criticism, even if it's constructive criticism. They're not usually wide open to that. So
no, this guy got called out by everyone in the community and proceeded to do it more. So.
Change subject.
So I mean, it doesn't really help.
Well, there's always going to be that, and there's discussion around that happens in along the lines that this is something unique to the reptile community, and it really isn't. You have if you talk to people who scuba dive, or people who skydive, or people who ride motorcycles, or people who hang glide, or do any recreational activity where there's an element of risk, you'll find divisions in those groups as well, where there's people who take their safety seriously, people who take their sport seriously, and they tend not to embrace people who do reckless things and make it worse. So that's not a herp world thing. That's something that you'll find in any vocation or avocation where there's an element of risk involved.
Absolutely.
Do you feel, we've kind of talked about this before with other podcasts, do you feel like there should be some body that controls, like USARC is for the us against other snake people, but like, do you think there should be some organization who kind of polices ourselves? Yeah.
Oh, wow. What a can of worms. That's policing ourselves is not something that we have done a very good job at. So I'll try not to stray too far after your question. Should there be a body? Yeah, I mean, that would be the ideal situation, would be if we policed ourselves. Because if we leave it to somebody else to police us, or we put ourselves in a position, or we put the public in a position where they feel like they need to police us.
Right.
When that's done legislatively, well, yeah, it's not going to be what we want, but also when it's done legislatively, it tends to be badly done. Whether it's at the municipal level or county or even state level, the laws that deal with, whether it's venomous animals or exotics in general, or tigers or large constrictors, those laws are not written by people who know the animals well, who know husbandry well. They don't know, they don't know the community. So they're written by people who don't have the community's best interest involved, and they're usually sloppy. They're clumsily written, and very rarely does a state come up with something that's really good. Now, Florida has probably, and there's plenty to criticize about the licensing program for Venomous in Florida, but of all of the licensing, state level licensing programs in the U.S., Florida probably has the best, well thought out model. It is arguably a little excessive in that it requires 1,000 hours of experience per family. So if you are keeping venomous colubrids, that's a different 1,000 hours than elapids, and that's a different 1,000 hours than different from vipers. And
I like that.
Yeah, obviously.
I did.
Well,
no, that's
you think it's too much.
Well, it's one of the ways it doesn't make sense is what could you do for 1,000 hours with Gila monsters?
True. What is there to talk about?
And then if you cut it in another way, it would be the same license that would allow you to keep, small elapids like, Cape coral cobras, which they're not among the most dangerous elapids out there. But that same license allows you to keep mambas and king cobras, which are, those can be phenomenally dangerous animals in the wrong hand. So it could be better, but there's the good things that happen in Florida are that caging is inspected, that they don't prohibit it outright. But one of the most remarkable things is that the herp community has engaged with, Florida authorities, and there's an open and ongoing dialogue. The people in Florida, Department of Wildlife are Florida Fish and Game, I think it is. They're engaged with the herp community, and we have good people like Jack Vicente, who frequently represents the interest of private keepers, and a good number of others who, they don't sit back and complain about it, and they don't wait till after something's happened, and they don't get loud with empty bravado about how I'm not going to adhere to these laws. They actually engage with the authorities and have a hand in crafting the legislation that impacts them. And I think that maybe more than anything else is the best example that herpers could follow in other states of just, getting engaged. We're not, as a community, we are not very good at that.
Yeah, that's something that in Texas is so very clear when it comes to things like rattlesnake roundups. It's that Texas Parks and Wildlife is actually on the side of roundups for the most part, rather than protecting the wildlife. What the fuck does that doesn't make any sense? Yeah,
there's the roundups. Letter of the law, the roundups are not even legal, but they're essentially still officially sanctioned, and they turn a blind eye to the animal cruelty aspects of it and things like that. Texas and Oklahoma too are a couple of really, really difficult cases. And, we hope that, over time they will, either through necessity or enlightenment, will kind of turn those festivals around and make them something a little more productive. But I think you're right that there is something special about the mindset in those states that makes them very resistant to change.
Right.
And I mean, obviously, I don't know if you'd know this, but you talk about wildlife, but kind of like Ray said, is our community out there doing what we need to do to change it?
Well, we are very out there,
especially
people like Todd.
And Todd, right?
Todd
RAR is, which so thankful for RAR. Should we plug them? I feel like we should.
That stuff.
Like
no, you got it. We've already done a whole podcast on it.
Yeah. But I don't feel like RAR has the backing of the whole snake community.
Right. I mean, we don't even collectively, between the Rattlesnake Festival people and now Todd and that's divided now. They're not even on the same page. Yeah, well, one of our handicaps, I think, as a community, I mean, herp people, is, collectively, we are not the most socially well-adjusted people. We tend not to get along. I mean, we tend not to get along well with others. And I don't know
we're herpers because we're misfits, or we're misfits because we're herpers. It's, it could be a little of both, but we don't do cooperation very well. And at the same time, the herp world is big enough where there are subdivisions of it, or special interest groups, groups that are specifically interested in rattlesnake preservation, or rattlesnake roundups, or venomous venomous rights for the private keepers. And that is a very, very long way from people who breed leopard geckos. Those groups don't, they're all under the herp umbrella, but they don't overlap very much. In fact, I would guess that there's probably more overlap between venomous keepers and people who work with raptors and other birds, but specifically raptors. There's probably more overlap there than there are with people who, work with ball pythons or turtles or things like that. It's a big world, and to get everybody pulling toward one goal is, it looks good on paper. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I kind of want to bring up something that is also controversial, because I'm so interested in it because of I'm interested in all things that are superhuman and like human optimization. So,
where are you going with
in
this?
one way, I'm intrigued by self-envenomation, right? And in another way, I'm all those dudes are fucking crazy, and I'm not sure which way is which.
Oh, I actually wanted to talk about this. Okay, cool.
Oh wow. Well, so here's the upside. It's your show, so we can talk about it. It actually, self-immunization is the one topic on my own group, on the Venom Interviews group on Facebook, that is called out as having worn out its welcome. And because of the fact that there's a lot of it, the discussion gets really, really noisy really quickly. And it turns, usually the conversation turns sour, and within 30 minutes, it's a full-on bar fight, and nobody wants to deal with that. But I guess I would let you guys drive that. Where do you want to take that discussion?
Well, I feel like there is some merit to it, but go on.
Okay. Totals, quicks.
And we're venomous noobs, so it's this.
Well, I'm a snake noob, and definitely venomous noob. But just from knowing you in a little bit, and I even typed to you earlier, what's the name of the guy?
Bill Haas.
Yeah. So it's my introduction to historical venomousness was obviously through him, and talking about Bill Haas, and looking at the books, and all that.
I love Bill Haas.
We
have the same birthday. You know that?
That's weird.
Yeah, no, it is weird.
But you have books. You've almost bought even more books about this guy.
Signed copy of.
Yeah, he was trying to convince me to get a signed copy. It was out of our budget for a book.
It was expensive.
For a book. But yeah, so my experiences with him, and hearing that, I'm like, that shit is crazy. No, never, ever. I don't know. I don't know anything else past him.
Well, I'll bring up the first issue is that he
go.
said that he cured people from giving them blood transfusions, but were those people going to die if they didn't get his blood? I don't know. We don't have a control group.
Right. There's no control. There's no way to answer that. So there's a bit of mythology around Bill, but Bill really did do some pioneering things. I mean, he did save people, or at least treat people, or his blood was used to treat people who were envenomated by things for which there was no antivenom. And so those are real stories, and that happened a good number of times. It wasn't a once or twice thing. I think it was around 20 times, or somehow the number 22 is stuck in my head.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it happened a good number of times. At the time that Bill was doing it, you could definitely make the argument that immunizing himself, when he's working with, 100 species of snakes, most of which had no antivenom. I mean, this started 70 years ago. So working with animals for which there is no antivenom is one scenario where I can imagine that you could make a persuasive argument that that something like that. You notice I'm choosing my words carefully, but I can imagine a compelling argument in that scenario. The list of species for which that is still true is is diminishing. It's a smaller and smaller list of species. So there's pretty much antivenom for virtually all the cobras in the world. There's for most large viperids that are responsible for snakebite morbidity and mortality around the world. There's antivenom for those. There are certainly some very very serious snakes for which there is no antivenom. One that comes to mind are the Malaysian blue coral snakes, the Calliophis from Southeast Asia. That is an amazingly serious snake. It has a venom unlike any other elapids. In fact, in some ways, it's more similar to some marine animals. It does some really. There's no snake bite that's a good way to die, but that one's especially.
By marine animals, do you mean like
cone snails?
Okay.
Yeah, like spastic paralytics, which typically the paralytics from snake venom are flaccid paralysis, where things stop working, whereas the spastic paralysis from Calliophis causes everything to work all at once. So it becomes
like intense muscle spasm type
deal?
Or?
Yeah, full body muscle spasms. And so when Brian Fry found that in, I think it's been about 18 months since that was published, there was the first time that toxins like that had been identified in snake venom. So kind of a cool discovery. But anyway, back to the original question. Are there cases where it makes any sense to do it? If you're working with an animal like that, for which there's no antivenom, and you're collecting venom for, say, research or for production of antivenom, well, somebody's got to be the first guy to milk that snake.
Horse.
Yeah.
Could a horse do it?
Put it right into the horse.
Yeah. Well, that if you gave a horse a full dose of that, I'm fairly sure it would be lethal to a horse.
You just need a really big horse.
Well, the starting doses, it doesn't take much of a neurotoxin like that to drop a large animal. Neurotoxins, it doesn't take much because they have small targets to hit. So it doesn't take a lot to overwhelm even a big animal. They start with astoundingly small doses when they're inoculating horses for antivenom production, and they build them up over time. But the first doses are nowhere near what that snake can deliver in a full bite.
So, I mean, you're essentially doing the same course on a human, though, right? You're starting slow and eventually ramping up.
Yeah. So the idea is that you start slow and it ramps up, and you're hoping to, or the goal is to build a titer of antibodies that is equivalent or analogous to what a horse is doing or a sheep is doing when you produce, you raise antibodies in them. We are a lot smaller than horses, so building up enough antibodies to do that is it's a non-trivial task. But the reality is that this is how immunology works. It's how our biology works. So does it work? Does it provide protection? I think the real answer is that the data that's out there is too little in quantity and not and insufficient in quality to definitively answer that. But I would be generous enough to say, yeah, there's, at least for some classes of toxins, there seems to be enough anecdotal cases where it provides some pretty serious protection. Now, if you have venom that's really, really cytotoxic, stuff that does serious tissue destruction, and in my neighborhood we have these big lancehead vipers, and what they're famous for is just melting flesh. They do tissue damage unlike almost any other snakes in the world. It is hard to imagine a titer of antibodies that would be high enough to mitigate, to mitigate something like that. But the real answer, again, to come back to it, there's just not enough. There's not a large quantity of good quality data to address it very well.
Well, for people out there who don't know, like Bill Haas lived to 100, and he was into his upper 90s doing like yard work, digging holes.
Yeah, but you cannot contribute that.
Well,
no, you can't, and that's an important. Yeah, what Melissa said is important. The things that we know that cause people to live longer, good genetics. Let's start there. Good genetics, healthy lifestyle, staying active, you know, everything down to a community and family support. All of those things are known to cause people to live longer. The idea that has been inferred, and I think too much has been read into the fact that Bill Haas, you know, lived to be 100 and a half, and was inoculating himself. I think there's a temptation to attribute his longevity to the venom, and you can say absolutely that no, there is not enough evidence to make that conclusion. That is a real stretch, and I would no way I would put my name on that.
We just need more crazy bastards to try to get to 100 years. We just need a bigger sample size.
There's plenty of people that live to be 100 years, and none of them self-immunize. So,
right.
Just kidding, guys. Don't start self-envenomating yourselves.
Yeah, I would not something I would encourage people to do. There are some real risks associated with it. There are not just theoretical risks. There's cases where it's actually happened where people have done the math wrong and given themselves more than they expected. There's cases where people have, injuries, they have abscesses, they have infections, they have, they have things go wrong, and it hurts. Self-immunizing is an ordeal to put yourself through. So in any medical thing that you're going to do like that you're always weighing, what is the risk and the benefit, and what is the cost against the benefit. And I haven't yet heard a convincing case that either the benefit outweighs the risk, or the cost is probably negligible in this case. But just if we only look at risk and benefit, I just don't see the benefit. I have a hard time imagining any case where it is a better approach to envenomation than rapid response and antivenom. I can't think of a case where it's the preferred solution.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He just loves Bill Haas.
No, I like talking about it because everyone is curious about it, and it's probably beating a dead horse for people in Venomous, but we've never talked.
Well, I'm sure I will hear plenty about it.
So let's think of one thing that a misconception, I guess, from before I watched the Venom interviews was that, we have your neurotoxic snakes, which are mostly your cobras, your lapids, that stuff, and hemotoxic snakes, or your rattlesnakes. But it turns out that most species are kind of a mixture of all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's more complicated than that. And there are certainly examples of snakes that are really purely hemotoxic or almost completely hemotoxic. So boomslangs are a good example of that. Venomous colubrids from Africa. That's really what that venom does, is it causes bleeding. In Africa, a lot of populations of saw-scale vipers are kind of the same way. They're not neurotoxic. They don't do a great deal of tissue damage. In some geographic regions they do, but in some the bite site itself is unremarkable, aside from a little bit of swelling. But their bleeding is that they cause is so severe that you'll bleed to death, and they kill more people than any other genus of snakes. So you have those ones that are, that really do kind of fit into one category. And then you have things that are very purely neurotoxic. So, black mambas are a good example of that. That is a neurotoxic snake that doesn't do, you don't have a lot of coagulation problems with it. You don't have a tissue injury. In fact, the local bite site of a mamba sometimes can be hard to see. It can be a really surprisingly benign looking injury, considering how quickly it can be lethal. So you do have some examples, but in the vast majority of cases, and so rattlesnakes and cobras are good examples. So there's neurotoxicity is widely known in a lot of rattlesnakes. There's, everybody looks first at Mojave rattlesnakes as the typical example of a neurotoxic rattlesnake, but tiger rattlesnakes have Mojave toxin. Southern Pacific rattlesnakes have Mojave toxin. There's populations of eastern diamondbacks and timber rattlesnakes that are arguably more potently neurotoxic than they are either hemo or cytotoxic. So the answer is, and I think that the chapter you're referring to is referred to as it's complicated, and I called it that because it's complicated. Cobras are another good example. There's cobras are thought of as, these neurotoxic snakes, but cobras do horrific tissue damage. Even the nausea that are not spitters, nausea, kuthia, they can cause necrosis. They can cause, horrible tissue damage. And the cobras that are spitters, neurotoxicity is often not the principal feature of their venom. They do primarily tissue damage and cause bleeding problems, to the point that the real go-to is Mozambique spitters in South Africa, where they get into people's homes and it's one of the few snakes that will actually nibble around and do exploratory bites. So people don't even have to roll over on them. They'll crawl in and, there's a warm body and let's take a nip at that and see what that's like. And
well, that's awesome.
Oh, it's a real problem. And those injuries look like, I've described it as looking like a kitchen fire. It's like, it looks like you've been burned. It looks like a burn injury. It's horrible. So the real answer is that venoms are super complicated, and that's what makes them super interesting. And you find even within a category, so even within hemotoxic venoms that cause coagulopathy, they're not all the same things causing the coagulopathy. There's different types of coagulopathy. There's different types of neurotoxicity. Almost to the point that
I had realized that, through watching the Venom interviews, that even juvenile snakes, and compared to the adults, will have a different makeup of their venom in the same animal, from juvenile to adult.
Yeah, and in fact, that's typical of, that's more the rule than the exception in rattlesnakes. In my neighborhood, we only have one rattlesnake in Costa Rica, at least at the moment. They're all considered Crotalus simus. But their venom is so different that what I've been told by the people who produce the antivenom there is, if you're bitten by one that's less than 16 months old, don't even bother with the antivenom, because the venom changes so substantially that it's not worth getting. Now, I don't know that I would follow that. I think, since I don't know the age of the snake, can't tell by looking at it, I would probably go ahead and get antivenom. But the statement still stands. It's the idea that venom can change so completely from the time the snake is born in that last 6 to 12 months before they approach sexual maturity. It becomes a different venom, sometimes remarkably different.
Well, I'm sure you've seen, if you've ever seen bite victims or something, how closely can you take their word for something, whether it's a big snake, a small snake, what species it is? What do you do to identify it?
So there's a few things you can do. To answer your first question, do you take their word for it? I tend not to take people's word for anything. I'd rather look at what evidence they have. If somebody has a picture of a snake, that is obviously very helpful. This actually came up at the conference at Venom Week, which just concluded down at Texas A&M in Kingsville, where a couple of us did presentations on venomous snakebite in Africa, and another doc from Brazil did a presentation that was very similar about snakebite in Brazil. And that question came up: how do you identify snakes? Somebody's bitten out in the forest. How do you come up with an identification? And there are really two answers to that. One is, much of the time you will not have an ironclad, conclusive identification of what bit somebody. However, the second answer is that if you have a doctor who is experienced in snakebite or specializes in snakebite, and they know how to correlate the symptoms that they're seeing or the syndromes that they're seeing with differences in different snakes, at least down to the genus level, and you look at the geography of where the bite happened and the habitat where it happened, and if you happen to have a description from the person, if you put all of those together and they all are kind of in agreement.
That seems like you have to be really lucky to have that.
Well, you'd be surprised. In Africa, we're fortunate with some of the doctors that were working there that they happen to be they are snakebite specialists, and they know the snakes and their geography and their habitat very well as well. So when we come into a hospital and somebody has a certain set of symptoms, they are able to say with some confidence that this is probably Echis ocellatus, a sawscale viper, or this is definitely a mamba bite, and because of the habitat that it happened in or the area that it happened in, it was probably a green mamba bite. And so both of those are things that actually happened over the course of the work on the current project. But when you're in clinic where you have a doctor that has no training in snake bite, who doesn't know anything about the animals, and all you have to go on is a person's word who may or may not have seen the snake, who may or may not be very reliable in what they report, the description they report. And even if they report it accurately, or even if they get a picture of it, the chance of a doc being able to identify something that they're not familiar with, I wouldn't have a lot of confidence in that either. So it can range from reasonably good confidence all the way down to almost no confidence.
Now that we're like accidentally getting into it, what exactly are you doing in Africa as far as your new project?
So the latest project is a series of training videos to help doctors and nurses in sub-Saharan Africa manage snake envenomation. And the series will include everything from kind of overviews of the topic that talk about epidemiology and public health and public policy around it to modules that deal with the medically important snakes on the continent and how antivenom is made, and then a set of clinical modules that deal with pre-hospital care, first aid type things, to what you do in the clinic, how you administer antivenom, what to look for, how to assess good quality antivenom, to post-hospital care, post-clinic care, and wound care, and things like that. So the idea is to cover the whole scenario. And there's a very interesting statistic that we have learned in the process. So the baseline fatality rate for snake bites that present to clinics in Africa, it varies a little bit, but it ranges from the low to high 20% range. So of the people who are bitten, if they make it to a clinic, and the clinic has no special training, there's no antivenom, they're not equipped to deal with snake bite, the baseline fatality rate is astoundingly high. It's somewhere between a third and a quarter of those people don't survive, which is just a shocking number. By way of comparison, in the U.S., about 1 out of every 15 to 1,800 bites is fatal. So,
is that accompanied to the species that are over there as well, or is it just the resources,
or just lack of knowledge?
Well, it's a complicated problem. It involves it involves the training of the medical staff for sure. It involves the species for sure. But look at Australia. Australia has some of the most dangerous snakes in the world, but snakebite is very close to being a solved problem in Australia. They have 2 or 3 deaths a year, with some of the most dangerous snakes on the planet. And if you look around the world where snakebite morbidity or snake bites correlate, they happen in the tropics, in rural areas, so agricultural areas, or areas outside cities. But dying from a snake bite correlates very, very closely with poverty. It is a disease of poor people, which is why we see the hugely disproportionate impact in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, like places like India. The problem in Africa is almost it's essentially equivalent to what happens in India. It's the same, roughly the same population, roughly the same number of bites, roughly the same number of fatalities as far as we have any confidence in the data. So it's a massive, massive problem.
Is the culture there similar to others, to where time may be an issue as far as you may go to a tribe healer or something like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So in Africa, at least in the areas that we've been so far, what we have understood is that almost 100% of the people will go to a traditional healer first, and it's easy to write that off as ignorance or backwardsness, but that is a I really think that's an unfair way to characterize what's happening there. You know, people get bitten by snakes, and most of these are going to be non-venomous bites, or if they're venomous, they're going to be sublethal anyway. So they go to a traditional healer, and it appears to work. They go to the healer, and they survive. And so that looks pretty good. And the ones who get really bad, they may end up going to a clinic, and a quarter of them die. So they're acting on the best information that they have in front of them. What appears to be something that indicates that, well, you can go to either one and your odds might be comparable, whether you go to a proper clinic or to a traditional healer. They're acting on, what they think is the best available information, and the information they have might not be great, and their interpretation of that information might not be great, and certainly there is some superstition involved.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not all that's happening. To write it off as as just sheer ignorance or stupidity, I have a short fuse.
It's not
for that.
illogical if you were in their shoes and you saw that everyone went,
Yeah, and that's kind of the point that I try to emphasize, that if you're in their shoes, it does make a lot of sense what they do, because it appears to be effective. Now, going to any place where traditional medicine is traditional, to straight up try to cut the healers out of the cycle just doesn't work. It's a recipe for disaster, because it is deeply ingrained, and the healers are central to their communities. And so my friends at AVRI worked on this project in Sri Lanka, where they developed an antivenom there in cooperation with Clodomir picado in Costa Rica to produce an antivenom for the native snakes there in Sri Lanka. And they engaged the local healers to get them, to make them allies, and to help them recognize, here is something you might look for that might indicate a serious bleeding problem that might not be initially obvious, or here's something that would indicate neurotoxicity that's going to get bad really fast. So do what you're going to do, but encourage these people to get to a clinic as fast as possible. And at least from what we can infer from what's happened in Sri Lanka, it seems like it's a reasonable approach.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a weird question. Totally not important. But for the modules you're doing for the sub-Saharan Africa, what language are you doing them in?
Actually, it's a good question, and I'm glad you asked.
Okay.
I'm curious
because it's important. So we've started the project, and the time we've spent there has all been in West Africa. So we've spent time in Ghana, Togo, Benin, and most recently in Guinea. And aside from Ghana, which English is the language of Ghana, almost all the rest of West Africa is French. And in fact, quite a lot of Africa is French. There's other areas that are Portuguese. There are a few that are English. So the modules are produced in English, French, and Spanish. And there's some chance that they may go into Portuguese as well. We did get a Portuguese translation of one of the modules. Hasn't been rolled out yet, but Portuguese becomes important in countries down in the southeast part of the continent. And so it'll at least be those three, and possibly more over time. Arabic is another one that becomes important when you get to North Africa and the Middle East. So we want to have it in as many languages as we can reasonably do, and have it be useful.
Now, in those areas, does that certain antivenom that they would have on hand, does it need to be refrigerated, and do they have refrigeration and stuff like that?
That's a good question. The answer is the antivenom. Well, let me put it this way: for antivenom to be appropriate for Africa, it has to be heat stable without refrigeration, which means it has to be freeze dried. The antivenom that we were working with when we were there was freeze dried. It worked remarkably well. But you have not just the storage conditions. In fact, I wouldn't be super concerned about the storage conditions for a freeze dried antivenom, because it may be 80 or 90 degrees, but it's not going to sit on the shelf for very long because it's going to get used. There's lots of snake bites, and so that Antivenom is not going to sit there for years. It might be, days or weeks in a busy clinic. But the temperature during transport, if it's sitting in the back of a truck at 140 degrees, that's a problem. And that is something that has to be solved. I don't know if that was a roundabout way. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. And I was also another question stemming off of that. We know the high cost of antivenom here.
You took my question.
So
exactly
how do they
thinking.
get this antivenom that's thousands of dollars per vial?
Obviously, it's not thousands of dollars per vial. That's the important factor. It is the cost on the ground there in Africa, in the areas that we were, ranged from about, I guess the low end was $28 or $29 per vial, up to about $33 or $35 per vial. So it's much, much less expensive. A huge percentage of the cost of antivenom goes to regulatory fees and markups and just the expectations of return on investment producing antivenom for the developed world. That is very different when you're producing it for places like Africa or India, where that would never fly. You might have people that make $1,000 in a year, or half that much in a year. And so antivenom that's $2,500 a vial or $5,000 a vial is just a non-starter. But once you get down to the $30 range or $35 range, then some other possibilities come into play. So, for example, countries like Burkina Faso, which is just north of where we were in West Africa, has instituted, if I'm not mistaken, it's a 95% government subsidy for antivenom. So if you go in and get, say, 4 vials of antivenom, and let's say the cost is $100, what the patient ends up paying of that is $5 for 4 vials of antivenom. And most viper bites would be treated with, somewhere in that range of vials. Big vipers would obviously be more, but for them to pay, $5 or $10 or $20 for a total course of treatment, that's very, very different from paying $30 or $40 per vial. And so a big part of solving the problem that's where the public health and public policy comes in, is government subsidies are necessary if you're going to solve that problem for populations that can't afford the drug.
Mm-hmm. And how are you sourcing? Do you know where the antivenom comes from, as far as who's milking it? Does it come from the U.S. and gets exported and it's still that cheap, or is it made in Africa?
No, it's a European. The one that we're working with, the main antivenom partner we're working with on the project, is a European producer, a company called Inosan. And their manufacturing is split between Mexico and Spain, and they make some very, very high quality, exceptionally good, safe, heat stable antivenom that's appropriate for the country. But it needs to be made to cover the continent. You have 1.1 billion people there, and you have 1 million snake bites a year. So the amount of antivenom you have to produce is just staggering, and then you have to get it where it needs to go. It's got to get to the clinics where people can use it. So that is a huge logistical challenge. As far as where the snakes are milked, that venom is produced in. There are venom producers in both Mexico that produce everything that's needed, and there's producers in Europe, notably France, where there's plenty of venom to go around. Producing venom is it's probably the easiest part of the entire antivenom production process. Getting the venom is a solved problem.
How often do you get people asking if they can buy venomous snakes and milk them to make money?
Oh, a lot. Yeah. That happens all the time. And especially a couple of years ago, there was a year, 2 years ago, 2 years ago, I guess, when I won't even mention the name, but it's a dreaded series came out purporting to show the roads paved with gold, liquid gold, for milking snakes. The reality is that if you want to make $1 million milking snakes, you better start with 2 million. Because
plus the whole show was fake. It was fictitious.
Yeah, it was.
We know all those people, and they don't.
Yeah, it was complete. It was absolute fiction. It didn't have anything to do with the real world of venom production. So, I mean, to give you an idea, in the U.S., there's only a handful of producers. There's maybe a half a dozen. Even if you count small boutique shop, there's about half a dozen venom producers in the U.S., and there's not a market for any more.
Right.
There's people who I think maybe suspect that there's, even if they know that there's not a lot of money in it, they suspect that maybe there's some prestige or some fame or some street cred attached to producing venom. Well, you can produce all the venom you want, but you got to get, if it's a business, you got to get somebody to buy it. And that is a tiny, even globally, that's a tiny, tiny market. So there's more than enough venom produced in the world to satisfy the demand. But to answer your question, yeah, people ask that a lot, and I try not to roll my eyes too hard. I answer the question accurately and politely, but for anybody who might be listening that's imagining doing that, it is, unless you're doing it purely for the love of it, and even then, it is a risky thing to do, and if you don't have somebody consuming that venom, it's a risk for no real reason.
I'll say it. Don't waste your damn time.
No, yeah, don't waste your time. That's a nice blunt way to put it. Don't waste your time.
So if it's not more supply, what would it take to bring the costs down in the States?
In the U.S., that's a very hard question to answer, because all of the machinery, by machinery, I mean the regulatory agencies and hospitals' billing practices and their relationships with insurance companies and all of those different things that factor into what antivenom is charged out or billed out to the patient as. Changing those things is really difficult, and I don't see any reason to think that. We have a new pit viper antivenom that will be available in the U.S. beginning in October of this year. It is produced in Mexico. It'll be licensed under BTG, who is the producer of our current antivenom, which is Crofab. In Mexico, that is a fairly inexpensive antivenom. I think it's maybe $100 or $200 per vial. I don't see any reason to believe that it will be much cheaper than Crofab when it gets here to the U.S. I don't think that's going to change very much. And the U.S., for a country of 320 million people, we have 6,000 or 8,000 snake bites. It is a relatively small problem to deal with. So attacking the pricing on that, unless you are a self-pay patient,
it's never going to happen. Basically,
yeah, I'm not real optimistic. I'm not optimistic that that's ever going to change. But for the
a lot of people start to develop it, which shouldn't. Happen. You don't want that to happen, but
yeah. Well, our bites have held pretty steady. They don't seem to spike very much. But I think to get back to the rest of that question, what can be done to bring the cost down in the developing world? A couple of things. One is you have to produce it in huge volumes. You get economy of scale when you're producing 1 million vials of something versus 1,000 vials of something. It can be just a massive difference in what that product will end up costing. But then government subsidies, like I mentioned, which is a huge variable in how affordable the product ends up being, and reasonable distribution systems and things like that. So those are we know enough. We have enough case studies in countries like Mexico and Burkina Faso to know that it is a solvable problem. It is not an easy problem to solve, but the model of government subsidies plus good distribution plus training, plus large production runs, that works. It works, and it gets the antivenom where it needs to go, and it does it at a cost that can help people. So it's doable.
So a question here would be, how many doctors in range of where venomous snakes are actually trained to deal with snake bites and administer things like crowfab, and how readily available is it in the first place?
Do you mean in the U.S. or
Yes,
in Africa?
in the US.
In the U.S., there's a couple ways to look at that problem. So one of the ways you can look at it is that you know, snake bite. We could say that, well, maybe we're not very good at treating it because there's a lot of suboptimal snake bite care that happens, and it is largely attributable to the fact that, look, this isn't something that most doctors deal with day in and day out. In fact, most of them won't deal with it more than a couple of times in their career. So unless you're in snakebite country and you're a snakebite specialist and you get a lot of patients, to expect a doctor to be well rehearsed at something that they never see, that's not the real world. That's not a reasonable thing to expect. And a remarkable thing is that even if the treatment in the US is imperfect, our fatalities are 1 out of 1,500 or 1 out of 1,800 venomous bites. That is a pretty stellar success rate, considering that that the training could be better and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
So we do. And we have 5 deaths a year, plus or minus, in the U.S. It's terrible if you're one of those people or their friends or family. But considering the size of our population and the number of bites we have, it is a fairly well managed problem.
Yeah.
Could it be better? Sure, it could be better. But it is, especially if you compare it to places like South Asia or Africa, or even in Latin America where I live. It's head and shoulders above most places in the world. So in the U.S., Canada doesn't have much of a snakebite problem. They have some rattlesnakes, but you look at the U.S., Western Europe, and Australia. Snakebite is essentially a solved problem in those areas. They do a pretty good job with what they have.
Do we have any numbers on how many of those deaths are from allergies related to whether it's the antivenom or the bite?
Well, allergy related to antivenom, crowfab in particular, those are almost non-existent. Crowfab is engineered to be about as non-allergenic as a foreign protein in your body can be. So when there are allergic reactions to crowfab in particular, they tend to be pretty mild, if they happen at all. They tend not to happen at all, and if they do, they can be managed usually without a lot of drama. So deaths due to anaphylaxis from crowfab, I don't know of any. I do know that there were some dangerous anaphylactic reactions to the old Wyeth polyvalent, which was a very different type of antivenom, and they did have an occasional death from anaphylaxis. But that's not the case with any of the modern antivenoms, whether it's a fractionated immunoglobulin molecule from either the U.S. or Mexico. Those are not high risks anymore. I think they're believed to be a much higher risk than they are. Now, that said, a lot of the world still produces whole IgG antivenom. Where I am in Costa Rica, that's what's made in the country, and it does have a risk of allergy. It does have a risk of serum sickness, and people do get nice and sick from it. It's kind of the price you pay, but it's a good medication and it works. It's potent and it saves people. But back to your original question, as far as people dying from antivenom, that is in the U.S. I would say that is something that essentially it just doesn't happen anymore.
Right. Yeah, and I guess now to shift gears, I mean, we're kind of in the U.S., but what drove you, where you were already living in Costa Rica, to come over to the U.S. and talk about, make a documentary on people in the venomous profession in the U.S. in particular?
Well, when I made the film, or I should say when I filmed the film, and I did the principal photography for it, I was living in the U.S. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. So I finished editing after we moved to Costa Rica. But the story that I wanted to tell was, I thought that, that venomous snakes and the people who work with them show up a lot in nature and science programming. They show up on Animal Planet and Discovery shows, and they show up a lot. And so there must be something interesting about it. But at the same time, if it's interesting, why do they feel the need to sensationalize it and fictionalize it so badly? And I became kind of fixated on this question. Like, well, gosh, are we not interesting? If they, if it's not sexed up like that, is it not a story worth telling? And so my kind of hypothesis for the project was that, look, you can get rid of, the lights and the hyperactive host and, the overly dramatic narration and music, and you can get rid of all the noise and nonsense. And this work is interesting all by itself. It's the animals and the people who do it are interesting. So that was my premise. And so the film was an attempt to test whether that premise was true or not. And it turns out, well, you've seen the film. It was, I think that these are interesting people doing interesting work. And it was, and I think it's still fun for me to watch. I can actually watch the film as a fan of the subject and still thoroughly enjoy the discussion that's happening from people whose work I really respect a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these are definitely, there's no one probably more fascinating than Jim Harrison from Kentucky Reptile Zoo. Yeah. I mean, just his story alone will just blow your mind. Jim
is a great guy, and I got to spend a number of days. Kristen was also down at the Venom Week down in Kingsville, and so we got to catch up. But people who do unusual jobs tend to be pretty interesting people. And there's other, the other people who run Venom Labs, Carl Barden's lab down in DeLand in Florida, George Van Horn's lab that's, I think, is about 50 years old now. That lab's been there for a very long time.
Is that the coral snake lab?
Well, both George and Carl have coral snakes on the line that are used for, I think most of that has gone to antivenom production for the new batch of coral snake antivenom that was just released not too long ago. But they're producing coral snake venom as quickly as they can, and it's all getting bought. But to be able to do things like keep a colony of 50 or 60 or 70 coral snakes alive for a long-term basis and milk their venom and keep them fed and keep them healthy, that's pretty remarkable.
Well, if anyone's downplaying that, from what I have seen, you have to pinky pump every single one of your coral snakes so they don't eat readily on like rodents or something like that.
Rodents for sure. Most of the people, in fact, I believe that all of the people that I know of that are working with coral snakes in the U.S. tube feed them with a diet that's it varies a little bit from shop to shop, but it's a protein diet with some nutritional supplements. And you'll see in the Venom interviews, you'll see some of the tube feeding where there's after they do the extraction, they'll run a catheter down to the snake's stomach, pump a certain number of cc's of food, and pull it back out, and that's how that snake gets fed. So all of the
how do you do that for like 100?
One at a time. It is that. So coral snakes don't produce a lot of venom. I think an average yield is 9 or 10 milligrams of venom from them. So that's why coral snake venom costs $4,000 a gram. It's because it is a staggering amount of work to do it and to keep those snakes alive. It's they're hard. I mean, they're really. It's not like a Western Diamondback that's going to spit out 1,000 microliters of venom at a time. They're it's a one drip of liquid. Think of it this way: a drip of liquid. You think of a drip of water coming from a faucet or something. Each of those drips is say around 50, 60 milligrams, and you're getting a fifth of that, a fifth of a drop of yield from a typical coral snake at a time. Wow. And so it is grueling and thankless work. But the people who do it, but it's interesting work, and the people who do it tend to be pretty interesting people.
Mm-hmm. So did you have any background in filming or videography, or what kind of sparked this?
Well, I wanted to tell the story, as far as a camera, I was a fairly good photographer. So I understand how cameras work, how light works, how color works. Understand what it takes to get an image into a camera. What I did not have experience doing was telling a story in video. And in fact, one of the things I was most nervous about is I'm going to drive around the country and spend a pile of money and shoot 60 hours of material and not know whether there's a story in there. And if there was a story, I had to figure out how to get the story and put it together into something that kind of made sense. And I was lucky enough, by shooting so much material, I overcompensated for that lack of confidence by shooting a tremendous amount of material. And only about 3% or 5% of what I shot ended up in the finished film. Wow. So, but what was there was enough to craft the story that you see, which is kind of this collective biography of people who start with this childhood fascination that a bunch of us had, and then it sticks with them into adulthood, and they manage to find a career where that works. And then the film largely focuses on those careers and the work that they do and how they got to be doing it. And then it kind of wraps up with a retrospective of, looking back on their careers and what their recommendations are for the next generation.
If you don't mind, how did you allow yourself the freedom financially and time-wise to do all this filming and editing and stuff like that?
Well, so I've worked in technology as a software engineer and tech, all-around tech guy for a good number of years. And in Los Angeles, that pays reasonably well. And so after doing that for a number of years, and my wife and I always lived pretty lean, I had enough sitting in the bank to kind of fund enough to fund the time I thought it would take to do the film. I thought it would take 12 to 18 months, and it took just short of 5 years. So from that standpoint, it ended up costing a lot more than I expected, but it was funded out of my own pocket. There was no investors or outside funding. And in fact, I don't know if you could get somebody to fund a project like that. It's kind of weird.
It's very, very niche. Only we would understand this kind of thing.
I mean, the whole time we're saying that, I'm like, if he came to me and said, can I just go do this thing for many years? That probably won't make money for a while. Like, I don't know how on board I would be.
Yeah, it would be a tough sell, especially for kind of a passion project that was made by us for us. It's not something that's ever going to see the light of day on Nat Geo or Animal Planet. In fact, it exists for the purpose of skewering Animal Planet. Right. So they're not going to broadcast it. The audience, it really is. I guess I shouldn't be quite that pessimistic. It was aimed at the herp community, and it was a project that I did for the herp community. But one thing that's been really surprising and satisfying is that people who have a general interest in nature and science have been some of the most amazing audiences that I've met and presented to, and people that were not really herp people, or people who dealt with marine biology or wildlife conservation, or had only kind of a passing interest in snakes or reptiles. They dug it, and that was a pleasant surprise that it appealed to a wider audience than I initially imagined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that, like, I would care more about getting the stamp of approval from snake people themselves than if you're in like Sundance or something, It's
yeah. And the commitment that I made to everybody who appeared in the film is that even though obviously this huge quantity of material has to be edited, I'll keep it so that it's faithful to their to what they've said. And what I wanted more than anything else is I wanted their approval, because what typically happens in a lot of productions like this, you sign a release, and then what ends up being produced is not what you meant to say. It's not what you meant to. It's not the message you meant to convey. And I made the commitment to them that it would stay faithful to their original, the original meaning of their words, and that message wouldn't change. And so their approval was what was important to me, even more than the audience. I think I went at it from the standpoint that you know, if I was faithful to that, the audience would come along for the ride.
And I don't think your timing could have been any better. I mean, I know you filmed it, 5 years prior to it being released, but by the time you released it, it's, after Eaten Alive and after the Venom Hunters and all that stuff. So, I mean, did that fuel you through the process?
Yeah, I mean, because there was there was a constant supply of trash TV that kept me kind of energized and motivated and just angry enough to keep at it. Yeah, so shows like that every time you thought it had gotten as bad as it could get, something like Eaten Alive comes up, and it's like, oh god, there's no, okay, we've hit bottom. It can only get better from there, and then Venom Hunters comes up, and so I've kind of given up predicting that things have gotten as bad as they can get, because every time I've predicted that, I've been wrong. They keep getting worse. But yeah, I think you're right. The timing was fortuitous. I couldn't have engineered that better if I tried.
And it's like, I'm disappointed because I read the book Mother of God by Paul Rosalie, which is it's a guide from Eaten Alive, and it's basically about being in the Amazon and living in the Amazon and anacondas, and it's a really great book by a really great naturalist who totally fucked up his one chance at the whole TV thing. So
yeah, well, from what I understood, I haven't read the book, but I do know some of the other people who were either directly or tangentially associated with that particular project, and I know that what was pitched to Paul and what was pitched to other people was very, very different from what ended up being the final product. And that's not uncommon. I mean, that happens all the time, where they come along and say, we're gonna try to create something like this, and it's going to be educational, and they tell you what you want to hear, and then once they've got the footage and you've signed a release, they can do literally anything they want with it. And you can do some pretty evil things in editing, and you can twist people's words, and you can twist situations, and you can make things out to be, not just misleading, but completely fictional.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know how anything those contracts work, but I mean, you want to, I guess, have final say on what goes out there. You don't want to, I mean, I know just from making YouTube videos that I do stupid shit and then I'll make like a chase scene out of it when I never intended it to do. I just have fun editing it, and like you just spill beer all over yourself. But I mean, you can make so much in editing. You can make drama just from music and cutting that just didn't exist before.
Oh yeah, and that happens. That's more the rule than the exception, unfortunately. And so there are productions like that, like Eaten Alive and like Venom Hunters, that didn't start out to be as bad as they became. And it's a real conundrum for the people who want to get want to help make things better and want to have a more constructive message out there. You can either completely stand on the sidelines and know that they're going to wreck it, or you can try to participate and weigh in and cross your fingers and hopefully, maybe it makes it a little bit better. But then you run the risk of being misrepresented or misquoted or quoted out of context. So it's a real rock and a hard place for the serious people in the community about whether to participate in these or not, because you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Absolutely. Now, there's so many people who are interested in this kind of thing and want to do the right thing. So how did you get past that whole, you're not exactly a documentary filmmaker. How do you have the balls to go for it and make a great documentary?
Oh, wow. I had a clear idea in mind of the story that I wanted to tell, or not exactly the narrative that came out, but I had an idea of what I wanted to communicate. That I thought that there was a good story in the real people doing real work with real animals. I thought that was I felt strongly enough and I was confident enough in that premise that it was worth doing. And when I talked to the people who were involved in the project, that goal resonated with them. but they're also, some of them were also a little bit, a little bit skeptical because they've been told similar things before and they didn't always turn out the way people promised. But it took a little time to build, I guess, to build the confidence that I was doing what I said I was doing, and that the finished product was going to be what I committed to at the beginning. And because it was paid for, it was paid for out of my money, out of my own money. I didn't know that whether it would ever make a profit. I approached it very much from the standpoint of economics be damned. I'm making the movie that I want to make. I'm making the movie I want to see, and if it breaks even, great. If it never breaks even, then I've still made the movie I wanted to see, and the experience will have been worth it. But I guess part of it was, the balls to do it is part of it is not knowing what you don't know. If I think I've said before that if I had known going into it that it would cost as much as it did, or take as long as it took, or be as hard as it was, I probably wouldn't have done it. I mean, no sane person would dive into something like that, knowing it was going to be so difficult. It was a tough project.
Now, knowing what you have now, are you going to do another project?
Well, you have so much more footage. You said it was only like 3% or 5%. So
yeah, there's a good bit in there. I mean, but really, what's in the film is the best of the best. It's the stuff that is most worth seeing. I have plenty of B-roll of animals and other things that may find a use some way and someday. The current project, once the training series in Africa is done, I would love to do something like the Venom Interviews, but I can see regional editions of it. So one in Africa that might piggyback on what we're doing there. Certainly one in Latin America, because Latin America has its own unique characteristics, and Asia has its own unique characteristics. There's amazing things, stories to be told in China and India and Nepal and Vietnam and Thailand, and that could be a whole other project. But one thing I guess I can definitely say is I can't do those out of my own pocket. Those would require some kind of fun.
You can't just drive around to all those people.
No, I mean it costs a lot of money to do it, and it costs a huge amount of money and time. To take time away from a normal 9-to-5 job, and you're grinding through cutting up video, and you're making progress, but you don't know how much longer it's going to take, and that was torture. To be at the desk for 12 hours a day and be making progress and still never, until very close to the end, not have a good sense of when it was going to be finished. That kind of uncertainty is very hard to work through.
Did you expect the kind of embrace you got from the Venomous community, or just the reptile community in general?
It's definitely been a pleasant surprise, and it is one of the things that has absolutely made the project worth it, is that what I thought was a worthwhile project was also what so many other people thought was a worthwhile project. So that's hugely satisfying. It helped that I started building a community around the project and keeping them updated a couple of years in advance. And I didn't intend to do it that far in advance. It just ended up taking that long. But the fact that a large community had grown up in anticipation of the project, that kind of blew my mind. That was certainly not something I could have predicted. But that is certainly one of the things that kept me energized, is I had, as a group of 7,000 people, then 8,000 people, then 9,000 people, all banging on my door every day saying, is it almost done? Is it almost done? Is it almost done? And so, you cannot have done all this work and have it so close and then give up. But, people wanted to see it, and, they value it. It's important to them. And so I had to finish it.
I mean, that is a good problem to have. Yeah.
It really is.
I have 2 questions. Is your wife as passionate about venomous snakes as you are?
She's passionate about me being safe. So no, my wife is not a herper. She is incredibly tolerant, and she is, we have an office full of pit vipers and coral snakes and who knows what else at any given time. So she's been, she knows that I work safely with the animals, and so she, as long as I'm, doing that responsibly, she's supportive, and she was amazingly supportive through, the duration of the project, more so than, probably more so than most people would have been. She was just a rock star through it. And that said, she's fairly adept. She can identify most of the local snakes that we run across frequently. We ended up having a terciopelo in our house that she found and identified. And that's not an animal that you want to, a lancehead viper under the dryer is not something you want to discover inside your house by accident. But
no, definitely not.
But she's a great sport, and she's been a phenomenal support through the project.
And now, gaining all you have from our community as a whole, what can the private keepers, obviously we're not herpetologists or biologists or anything like that, what can the private keepers do to maintain integrity in our hobby?
Treat it responsibly. Have respect for the animals. If you keep them just for the joy of keeping the animals, I don't look down on that. I think that's perfectly fine. You don't have to have a scientific mission, or you don't have to be engaged in citizen science to be a legit keeper. There's people who learn to breed stuff that we didn't know how to breed 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Lots and lots of that came from the private sector. And even if people just keep animals because they enjoy them, I think that's a perfectly legitimate reason to keep them. And if you're doing it responsibly, and you're not in it for your ego, and you're not in it for, you're not making things worse, it just isn't that hard. It isn't that hard. But for the people who do have some inclination to do scientific type stuff, reproductive biology is something that the private sector does a phenomenal job at. Occasionally you have private collectors who happen to have unusual venomous stuff that somebody wants a sample of. And so sometimes they'll provide, venom samples or DNA samples or shed skin, things like that. So, get to know, even if you don't feel like you're part of the scientific community or the professional community, get to know them. They're nice people. They're not scary. They don't bite. They tend to be pretty unforgiving to people who do stupid things. But
that's always, you never know whether it's frowned upon to be a public herp. Like, you never know because I guess some people in the like the scientific community don't exactly respect a lot of normal herpers and stuff like that. People just keep them in captivity. So I guess that's kind of.
Yeah, I think that might be true of some in the zoo community, but for the most part, even zoo keepers, and certainly a lot of the scientists who work with venom, not all of them, but a lot of them are herpers, or they are the kids who grew up catching garter snakes at 7 years old. That's how people start. So they do have some, they can relate to private keepers. They understand the allure of the animals. They understand the appeal. They understand that they're fun and interesting and cool. And so I think you would find that they're more relatable than I think people make them out to be. They're not, they're not scary. They're humans, and they're a lot of them are super fun, hilarious, smart people.
Yeah, I think it was just super interesting talking to Kathy Love a couple of weeks ago, and how intertwined the private keeping community was to scientific back in the day, just because there was so little of them. It was all kind of intertwined.
Well, that's still the case. In fact, when I started this project, I was thinking, okay, well, I really need to separate out private keeping from the professional and scientific stuff, because not that I thought that private keeping was any less important, but I thought it was a big enough subject that it would deserved its own kind of deserved its own project or its own treatment. But once I got into it, I realized that there's just no way to separate the private from the professional and scientific. They're all so deeply intertwined, and they depend on each other. So I would encourage people to, there's groups on Facebook like the Venom Interviews group where people who are enthusiasts and private keepers interface day in and day out with people who are doing, the cutting edge science on either venom or ecology or biology or, there's good husbandry information you can get from them. They're just a fantastic resource. And at heart, most of them are herpers.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. The first one, I don't know how to phrase it correctly, but shut up. It's kind of about changing people's views. So he's not ever interested, but like I'm someone who, obviously before meeting him, I knew nothing about snakes. Like they were just kind of a thing. I was never super scared of them, but I have friends. And so I love changing someone's minds about snakes in general. But obviously venomous is a whole different,
It's a harder
game.
sell.
Right. So is it something you try to sell to people?
I do. Well, so I do educational programs in my own community, and I live in a fairly small community there around the lake. And I do educational programs, and I'm the guy that people call for identification or for removal, and
Right.
I'm always happy to spend time, talking to people about the animals, and I'm always grateful when they call me instead of killing them. But over the 4 years I've been there, it has been really satisfying to see the change in, not everybody for sure, but definitely a change in attitudes of a lot of people who came down and, especially foreigners who moved down to a new country, and they're dealing with new wildlife that they've never seen before. And some of these they've heard horror stories about. But to be able to spend time up close with these animals, even animals like, the big lancehead vipers and rattlesnakes, for people to see that they're, that they are there's something to be respected, but they're perfectly manageable. And people are interested.
I can't do it.
I know and we found a Copperhead this weekend because she was filming us because we were doing a YouTube video. And, I was right there.
Very close.
But I mean, this is
Very
like
close.
the puppy dog compared to these snakes. But I mean,
it can still
but
hurt.
the Copperhead didn't move at all. Like, I was behind the log it was under, and it didn't move at all. And
you
she
were
was
like
very nervous.
4 inches from it, and I'm
4 inches from
yes,
it.
you were. I'm to take the picture. Yes,
the camera was. Yeah.
Your phone, your hands were around the phone, so your fingers were 4 inches from it, and I'm having a heart attack. Just 4 inches
is pretty close. That's pretty close to Copperhead.
Exaggerating. I'll show you the photo. You can tell it's from like a foot away.
He was so close.
Yeah, everybody has cameras on their phones, and some of the cameras are pretty amazingly good quality, and unfortunately they're very wide angle lenses, so you do have to get up pretty close to stuff. And I have seen people taking cell phone pictures of things that are closer than I would get. I like, a nice 100mm lens where you can get, and I can zoom up to a bushmaster's face from 10 feet away. That's a nice way to capture an image. But people say, well, how many times you've been bitten? And I've never been bitten by any front fang venomous snake, and I try to emphasize that I don't get bitten for the same reason they don't get bitten, because I don't allow the animals close enough to me to bite me, and I don't allow them the opportunity.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah, so there's no, you don't get extra points for for risk in my book. I guess in some books you get points for that, but I don't see the point.
I think your telemeters, your DNA gets a little bit shorter every time, meaning your life gets a little bit shorter. What were you gonna say?
Certainly.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's just that's always something that's very interesting to me. Like, how do you sell Venomous to people? But I think
it's tough. So it depends on the situation. If you can get people interested in the animal, or you can help them understand that this animal plays an important part in the ecology. And I would say that even the foreigners who move down to my area are maybe more concerned than average for the state of the natural world. So there may be a good audience. Maybe they're predisposed to hearing it. But it does depend on the animal. So if I'm talking to somebody about coral snakes present such a small risk in terms of it takes some real talent to get bitten by a coral snake. So you're perfectly safe observing a coral snake from 2 feet away. They're not that scary an animal. They have some very toxic venom, but getting bitten by them is not that takes some doing. But then on the other hand, if you're talking about the big bothrops, that is an animal that kills people, and they're big and they're nervous and they're easily frightened. And so what I try to emphasize with those animals is when I tell people not to kill them, it's not to protect that snake. That snake is common. They live around houses. They're all over the place. But if that snake is more than 4 or 5 feet long, if you're close enough to kill it, you're putting yourself at risk. And as long as you're 4 or 5 feet away from that snake, you're perfectly safe. But as soon as you're less than that, now your risk is going up, and there's not any benefit to killing that animal that's worth the risk associated with it. So the message depends on what it is we're talking about.
So people are very concerned with what you actually keep yourself.
Oh yeah, in the chat, they're interested in what you keep.
What I keep. So I have kind of an endless parade of species that come through the office. I have kept long-term. I've kept all the common pit vipers in the area. I don't tend to keep bothrops for very long because it's a higher risk animal. But then again, if I came across a bushmaster, I might hang on to that for a while. That's a pretty special animal. I tend to hang on to things that are either exceptional specimens for some reason. Either they're brilliantly colored or an unusual pattern. For example, there's some eyelash vipers in some populations that are striped, and lots of people don't even know that eyelash vipers come in there's a striped phase. And so when I first saw those, that blew my mind.
And that is as adults they're striped?
No, they're born striped.
And they stay striped?
And they stay striped. But I keep so I've kept I kept all the common vipers, I guess, with the exception of Atropoides, the jumping vipers. I haven't kept those for any long period of time.
I don't know what those are, but they sound terrifying.
Jumping vipers they're a short, fat little viper. They almost look like if you put a bushmaster in the wash and it shrank and it became short and fat. They look a little bit like that, but they're called jumping vipers because they strike so fast with so much force that they'll tend to slide across the ground. And their strike speed is really something you have to see. It's just like teleporting. So those are around, and those are around my area, and I just haven't, I've run into them, but I haven't kept them. Coral snakes I will sometimes hang on to, and if I can find something to feed them, I'll hang on to those for a little while. I really love coral snakes. They're a pleasure to have around. Feeding them is difficult.
Would their natural prey be other snakes?
It's almost always other snakes. We have some that will take frogs sometimes, and some will take another amphibian called Sicilians. We have these very large purple Sicilians that are common around the wet forest. And one of the corals, the bicolored coral, Micrurus multifasciatus, is a specialty feeder on those Sicilians. But for the most part, coral snakes are snake eaters. And so finding a supply of feeder snakes that I would be willing to sacrifice to the corals is, it's pretty hard to find, and they will generally not touch lizards. I have a pretty ready supply of skinks and geckos, and for the most part, they are not interested in those at all. But I've kept, interesting colubrids that I come across, some weird things that people may have never heard of. Sculocophus, there's a one called a Centipede Eater that's a black and orange and white banded snake. It's this cool, weird.
They call like the Harlequin or long-nosed snake. I think I've seen those before.
Yeah, so they're sometimes called Harlequin snakes. They look strangely similar to a variable ground snake in the U.S. and to an elapid, strangely enough, in South Africa called Homerocelaps. But there's this brilliant, beautiful little colubrid. Those are cool. I get a lot of bird snakes, formerly known as Sustes. Now they're Frindinax. I get lots of those. I get Spilotes, big tiger rat snakes occasionally. In fact, the last snake that got a piece of me was one of those a few weeks ago.
They're not known for being nice.
No, they're not super friendly. They're decidedly hostile. But in the middle of the day, found one stretched out across the road in a neighborhood and decided that neighborhood was probably not the best place for him. And so I caught him and relocated him, and he got a pretty good piece of me. And then we get weird stuff, like we have tricolored tantillas. Like in the U.S., you have black-headed snakes, and down there, another species in that genus is a tricolor that looks, I guess, passingly like a milk snake. And we have milk snakes. We have 3 species of milk snakes there. One of my favorite snakes are black milk snakes. Used to be Triangulum gaige, which they're up high, and at about 18 months old, they turn completely jet black like an indigo snake. Super, super cool snakes.
And
so
large,
I love
a pretty large.
Yeah, they're a big king snake. They're 5.5, 6 feet long and fairly heavy body. They're a nice big snake. I really like those a lot. But I'm always fascinated by anything I've never seen before. So, somebody will call and say, I've got this weird little snake, and what is it? And every once in a while, I get something that I can't readily identify because its coloration happens to not be well documented and it's not easy to recognize. And so those are always fun. To be in a place where you're getting lifers once a month is pretty cool.
Yeah, I'd probably pick up what I thought was a milk snake and die or something. This is a coral snake, so. Yeah,
well, we do have colubrids that look a lot like coral snakes, including the color
sequence. Rules don't apply anymore.
No. The rules, the rule that the dreaded rhyme that people are familiar with in the U.S. Becomes unreliable in Latin America, and it's not totally reliable in any country in Latin America. And the farther south you go, the worse it gets. And by the time you get to Costa Rica or even southern Mexico, there's plenty of species where it just completely falls apart. There's coral snakes that don't look anything like coral snakes. There's colubrids that look exactly like coral snakes. And so, you really have to be able to identify something before you put your hands on it.
Okay. I've said this a lot, but I have 2 more questions, but one is from the chat.
Okay.
Lily said, why do some people say to constrict the area that you got bit with a rag, and some people say not to?
So like tourniquet above your snake.
Tourniquets. Okay. So that could lead to a very long discussion. In our area and in the U.S., it's a never do thing. Never ever do it, because typically, what you would be doing if you have an envenomated limb and you cut off circulation to that limb, or severely restrict it with a tourniquet, there's a good chance that that's going to end up being amputated. So that is never ever ever. In the U.S., I guess you could probably concoct some scenario where it might make sense, but there's generally, if you're within a couple of hours of medical care, there's absolutely no reason to do that. In other parts of the world, if you could be a day's travel, and you might be in a situation where sacrificing a limb to save a life might be a reasonable thing to do. That there are scenarios in other parts of the world where that might play out, but in the U.S., that's not the situation we have. So to answer the question, why do some people recommend it? They recommend it because it's been a traditional thing. People didn't know any better, but it's bad advice.
I mean, that's traditional to the fact where you suck out the venom too.
Oh,
right?
yeah, that is not only the cutting and sucking is not only useless, but it's actively harmful. It exacerbates the local damage. So don't do that either.
That the cobras in my garden, there's pictures of Bill Haast, I believe, on a bite doing like suction cups and shit
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
actual site.
Well, we know more about that now.
Right.
It's been able to be properly studied now, and it's super clear that it doesn't provide any benefit, and there's at least some decent evidence that it exacerbates the harm.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what would be?
You didn't let me ask that.
Sorry,
I keep saying I have two questions, and I get my first one out, and the second one never gets answered. Okay, so my second question is, what are your thoughts on venomous snakes at shows?
Well, here's the way I think about them at shows and private keeping in general. I think you have to have a good reason to restrict people's rights. I don't like the idea that we have no rights unless they're given to us. I think we have the rights to do what we want as long as there's a good reason to take those rights away. And so from that standpoint, there's not, there's plenty of goof ups that have happened in the venomous community, and there's things that, people have been sold things they shouldn't have been sold, and people have sold things that they shouldn't have sold. But I think that those have not risen to the level that it justifies, statewide restrictions or anything like that. I think a licensing program like you see in Florida makes a lot more sense than prohibition. Prohibition tends to make things invisible. So you end up with things like cobras in apartments in New York City where they're illegal, but they're completely off the radar because they're not licensed. So as that relates to venomous animals at shows, there are still shows in various parts of the country, Texas notably, where you can buy gaboon vipers, and you can buy cobras, and you can buy eyelash vipers, or anything that you're interested in, you can buy them. And I think my overriding principle is that unless there's a good reason to take those rights away from people, they should not be restricted. And I don't think you can make a case that that the threat to the public, the threat to people other than the keeper, is right. It rises to the level that it justifies restriction.
And
was that a careful enough way to answer that?
Yeah, no.
So as far as if you are a private keeper, what are your resources for antivenom? I mean, if you're keeping something, is it smart to keep a gaboon viper in Kansas, or like what are kind of smart rules to keep if you're a private keeper, basically?
Oh boy. So when you're talking about antivenom for exotics, that is an especially sensitive topic because the overwhelming majority of private keepers who keep exotics do not have their own antivenom. And in fact, most of them don't know where their antivenom is going to come from in the event of an accident. Typically what happens is there's a 911 call. There is eventually a call to poison control. Poison control can look up the nearest source of antivenom, assuming they have a valid ID on what bit the person. They can look that up on an antivenom index that keeps track of what all the zoos have in various areas. But my sore spot with that is even if a zoo has it, that zoo's antivenom is not yours to take. It's not a public resource to be plundered. Yeah, and it puts the zoo's staff at risk. And so that's, to me, part of personal responsibility is if you're going to keep these animals, you need to do what it takes to get licensed to import the antivenom. And if it costs, if you're going to keep a king cobra and it costs $120 a vial, and you need to have 20 vials of that antivenom, then your $1,000 for the cobra and $2,500 for antivenom is just part of the cost of ownership. And unfortunately, that is something that is badly neglected. I do not think it would be unreasonable that private keepers be either required to have their own antivenom or to participate in a co-op where, say, for example, all the venomous keepers around San Antonio pool their resources and buy antivenom for the snakes that they're keeping. That makes a lot of sense to me. It does not seem to me to be very responsible to rely on somebody else's antivenom that isn't yours. It's not there for you. That's not personal responsibility.
And what's the shelf life typically on something like that, on antivenom?
Usually it's around 3 years. One of the arguments for keeping, if you're going to keep natives, at least start with, or keep venomous to start with natives, is that's what crowfab is for. And the hospitals in snakebite country are going to have crowfab, and you don't have to worry about stocking that yourself. But if you're importing it yourself and you're keeping it, refrigerated, it's good for, well, it's good for a lot longer than the official shelf life, assuming that it doesn't get contaminated. But the official shelf life is usually in the range of 3 or 3.5 years. Although antivenom that's 5 and 6 and 8 and 10 years old has been used, and as long as it's not bad, it might have lost a little bit of its potency, but the benefit is still greater than 0.
Right. And how many vials would you keep on hand if, saying, you're a keeper with, king cobras or something like that? How many vials would you keep on hand just in case?
Wow. Well, obviously it depends on the size of the snake and the species.
I picked like the biggest fucking snake for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, you picked one of the few snakes that can actually have you dead within an hour. For a king, I think I would be somewhere in the 20 vial range before I felt like I was adequately covered. But if it's $100 and some a vial, you're looking at somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 to bring that in. Overall, that's not, considering the cost of a king cobra and what it costs to maintain a king cobra. That's an expensive snake to get, and it's an expensive snake to feed. That's part of the cost of ownership. It's like, if you're gonna have a car, but you can't afford to put gas in it, or can't put tires on it, or you can't afford to insure it, then you probably don't need to have that car.
Absolutely. And then what other kind of things have you seen? Because you've obviously gone to so many venomous collections. What are some protocols that you see that you deem necessary as far as caging, as far as the room goes, and everything like that?
Well, the kind of best practices there is that the cage itself needs to be escape proof, and the room that the cage is in needs to be escape proof, meaning that if something happened to get out of a cage, that it cannot get out of the room. And so there's ways that the doors can be, that they can seal completely. And there's various ways people have done that. But the objective you want to achieve is you want to have escape-proof primary containment, meaning the cage, and escape-proof secondary containment in the room. And so both the cages and the room should be locked. It should be, you should have a pre-existing relationship with an emergency room doctor that you've talked to beforehand. Showing up in the ER, never having talked to anybody at the hospital before, is not a way to be prepared. You can have all the protocols you want, but even a written protocol, if you haven't discussed that protocol with your doctor, it's of no use whatsoever. They're not going to take a second look at it. So having a relationship with a doctor is kind of the second thing. So maybe the three most important things is proper housing, primary, secondary containment, proper handling, where you're hands off with the animal as much as you can be, and it never has an opportunity to bite, or whether it bites is never left up to the snake. It's always under your control. And the third is that in the event of an emergency, you are able to fall back on a relationship that you've already developed with an ER doc who's willing to deal with a very unusual kind of injury that's going to be time sensitive when it comes in. Those are 3 really important factors, I think.
I've seen so many different things. It's hard to say what is proper handling, is because there seems to be different styles of thinking. Like, who would be a good person to model yourself after, or to look up, even if it's on YouTube or the internet?
Well, if you look at people who have worked an entire career with no bites, those are always who I think are my favorite people to learn from. As far as people who are in the film, there's a number of people who've gone their whole careers with no bites. Bry Loist up at Indian River, Jeff Fobb at Venom 1, no bites. Dino Ferry at Jacksonville, no bites. I cannot claim to have handled the quantity of snakes that they have, but I've had no front fang venomous bites. And then there's other very, very good handlers who are featured in the film people like Terry Phillip. I have immense respect for Terry, and I don't think you could do a better job of a mentor than somebody like Terry. But I don't get real picky about, this kind of hook versus that kind of hook, or tongs versus no tongs. I think ultimately what you want to achieve is that the snake's head is always under your control, and that whether the snake bites you is never left up to circumstance, or it's never left up to the snake. But the goal of good handling is that the snake never has the opportunity to bite you. And you'll hear over and over again that, well, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I think that's absolutely nonsense. I reject that completely, because plenty of people have gone their entire careers without ever having a dangerous bite. And I would like to go the rest of my life working with these animals without ever having a medically significant accident. And it's doable.
Absolutely. So what would be what you would consider a good starter? Would it be something, I see a lot of people start with things that are native, and then I see a lot of people start with things like eyelash vipers or small arboreal snakes.
Also, let me preface this that he's asking this for other people because he's never getting one.
Well, there's, if you're working with small native species, so copperheads are a really good example. So of the North American pit vipers, they're the ones that are, generally they're the ones that are least likely to deliver a lethal bite to you. It hurts a lot, but with rapid treatment, they tend, usually you get by without even a whole lot of tissue damage. So in the U.S., copperheads are not an unreasonable choice. I like mangrove snakes as training snakes because they are constantly trying to bite you, and if they do get a hold of you, you'll feel it. And they're difficult. They're a snake that's big, and they're challenging to hook. Eyelash vipers, I would say, eyelash vipers are one of the easiest snakes I've ever dealt with, even though they're arboreal, because they're not very big. And so if you have a 30 or 36 inch hook, that animal is always at a distance that it's always at a distance that's safe to handle. They can be a little bit nippy, but for the most part, if you handle them slowly and gently, they're not an especially difficult animal to work with. Not like some other arboreal vipers. Eyelash vipers, people do sometimes get surprised by their reach. They can put just a little bit of the end of their tail around a branch to hang on to and launch the entire rest of their body at you. So sometimes that reach catches people by surprise, but again, they're not very big snakes. I don't think I've ever seen a wild one much over 2 feet long. Sometimes you'll have 3-footers in captivity, but a 3-foot eyelash viper is that's a big girl. That's a monster.
The one thing that scares me, I see most people start off with like a gaboon viper because everyone loves gaboon vipers.
That's absolutely insane. That's no. What if you've ever seen a bitis, and all the bitis can do this, but rhino vipers, gaboon vipers, puff adders, you're sitting there with a snake that's 10 pounds of muscle with nothing to move but itself, and they can explode in a way that it is hard to describe until you've seen it happen. They can pretty well bite anything, within a radius of their body length from just about any direction. They are, that is a formidable snake, and they get big. You might buy a baby gaboon, and 6 or 8 years later, the thing is 5.5 feet long. That's a snake. One of the patients that we had die in Guinea died of a gaboon bite. He bled out of his intestines 12 hours after he was bitten and died. And people think of this as a starter snake. I think you're absolutely out of your mind if you think that's a starter animal.
Yeah, I don't want to get bit by something with teeth as big as its fangs, even if it's not venomous, let alone.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you want to really learn your hooking and handling skills, things like tree bows, corrales, any of the corrales.
I was about to say, we're already contemplating a basin, but like when you think about those teeth.
Yeah, our corrales and I mean something like even an emerald, I don't want to get bit out just because of the teeth size, but the attitude of the Amazon tree boa is.
Yeah, so you have things like there's racers, there's big Asian rat snakes like Pitayas that are a real handful.
Mhm.
So and until you feel really good and really comfortable using tools, hooking animals in and out, I personally think that learning to use your tools, getting comfortable with tools, to the point that the use of tools is automatic. I see no problem learning on snakes that are real defensive and maybe a little bit nasty. Tree boas and mangrove snakes are probably pretty good for that. But they're not life-threatening animals, but there still will be a price to pay if you get tagged by them.
Right.
So I wouldn't, you don't want to get sloppy about it.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything as close to rattlesnakes as my pines are, as far as they never calm down. They always, S up and rattle and do the whole defense thing. It's like that's basically having a rattlesnake without having to ever get bit by one.
Yeah, or ever touch
Yeah,
it. I never touch it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, I can't, unless you have to do some kind of veterinary procedure, and even that, that's what tubes are for. The idea of ever having to put your hand on a snake that's largely imaginary. There are very few situations where that's ever really required.
Right.
And you know what? People say, well, you don't understand the connection I have with the animals. And look, I totally get the desire to handle snakes, even venomous snakes. I understand the desire. I get it, because I think there's, that is a cool experience, but it's not something that ever outweighs the risk of a dangerous animal.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but your feelings never come into play when you're dealing with venomous snakes or even my corn snakes. I know that they don't love me, motherfuckers.
No, they don't.
Handle, your rattlesnake definitely doesn't love you.
No. I mean, they're not working on the same level as your dogs.
Right.
They might dislike you as much as your cats.
Yeah, they're kind of a love-hate indifferent. They're either indifferent or they hate you. Yeah, there's indifferent or hate.
Yeah. They don't love you.
No, the idea that I think people imagine that they have special relationships with snakes is, I think that's almost completely imaginary. It's like having a relationship with fish or something.
It just makes you feel good.
It's self-centered.
Yeah, yes, it makes them feel better.
You feel good. Yeah, and it makes you feel. Now there are certainly some snakes that are really smart. King cobras are one that is always called out as an exceptionally smart snake, and I think there's plenty of evidence that they do things like recognize their keepers and behave differently for this person than they would for that person. But that doesn't mean that that they're going to cut you some slack just because you're the guy who feeds them. That just doesn't work like that.
Absolutely. Well, Ray, now that we're winding down, is there any way that people can get in touch with you, or where they can find the Venom interviews if they want to watch the film?
Sure. Well, it's available in two ways right now. The Venom interview, if you go to thevenominterviews.com, that's kind of the best place to start. And in addition to things like a blog and all the information about the cast and so forth in the film, there are links where you can buy the film. If you want a physical copy, it's still available on Blu-ray. There are still a limited number of copies left, but there's still some in stock. The DVDs are now officially sold out. So the DVD format is gone. Blu-rays are still available, but the feature film is available streaming. And that's only about $8. So if anybody was holding out for, because they don't want to deal with physical media, or it is available streaming on Vimeo, and the link to that is on thevenominterviews.com.
That is awesome. And is there anything else that you want to get out there before one last thing to say?
Oh, I would say, props to you guys for doing a show like this, and for, one of the things that I've tried to emphasize to the herp community is nobody's going to produce good quality programming for us. We have to do it ourselves. And so I've been beating the drum about, we have to be our own media and be our own media. And, if even if you're out there, you're making 5-minute videos or 10-minute videos, we need to be our own media, because nobody's going to do it for us. And so props to you guys for doing that.
Thank you very much. It kind of went through kind of a weird time in the last like week or two about me denying an opportunity. That's exactly what you're talking about. So it makes me feel good. I mean, I hope
Stop.
that
Didn't
I
need
would
to bring
love.
that up.
I know. I'll talk to him after. But like, I'd love to be not fucking Animal Planet. That's really it.
Yeah.
I
Just
don't know.
that
I hope
they
I
are
don't-
they're the example of what not to be.
Absolutely.
So you're saying if right now Animal Planet came to you, you'd say no?
Well, I mean, I don't know.
I would. On the record. On the record, I would say no. I won't.
Because he knows how they distort
They're
it.
disgusting. Yeah, they're disgusting.
Yeah, well, I had a certain run-in with someone.
Stop.
All right.
Okay.
That's too much. Thank you, Ray.
Okay. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone who's participated in the chat. And
thanks for keeping up with our like noobish venomous stuff because we're not
expert. We're not even novices
Oh.
in venomous.
I watched your movie, so I'm an expert.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm I've the things that I've learned from other people as well. So I'm happy to share what I know, and there's plenty more for me to learn too.
Awesome.
Okay, so Ray, we're gonna talk to you for a little bit after, but we're gonna go off the air for the rest of the world.
Rest of the world.
Rest of the world. Thank you. Next week, I believe, same time.
Yeah, I don't even know who's
next.
On
well,
it's
we'd
not
have
on
to flip the calendar because next week. Oh wait,
no,
there's still.
I just didn't write it in.
Oh, okay. We don't know his. No, it's Oh my god!
Is it Howard?
It's no, it's
holy shit, Forrest.
It's
I'm just giving up all
I don't
of
want
our
him to be
guests.
listening. Selective scales.
Oh, it's Tony.
It's Tony. God, I couldn't think of his name. That's terrible. I'm such an awful person.
And he's gonna buy a copy of the Venom
Yes,
Interviews.
Tony Jerome, Selective Scales. He lives in Keller, Texas. I can tell you so much about him. I just couldn't think of his name.
See you next week, Tony.
And he'll be here. Like
that's Carpondros, carpets
yes,
to chondros,
and he'll actually be in
most circles.
the apartment. So that'll be cool again to have someone.
He'll be right here.
We haven't had someone actually here in a long time.
That'll be fun.
So yes, thank you guys. Sorry, Tony. I hope you're not
we're
listening.
going off now.
Okay. Everyone else,
you're supposed to say portcitypythons.com.
Oh, sorry. If you want to talk to us, hit us up on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, all across the board. It's Port City Pythons. The website is portcitypythons.com. We have the shirts, all that fun stuff.
That's it.
Be on the lookout for more lockup pictures, hopefully.
Yeah, I fucking hope so. These snakes are ridiculous.
We better.
Can't
okay.
Control them.
Okay.
Later, peoples.
Pause that.
Pause.
And then stop.